Hi, I'm Gabriella, for those of you who don't know me, and for those of you who do know me, hi! I just thought I'd make a little video to explain a few of the foundations of the creative work that I do, whether it's my own writing or the online writing process that I run, Rites of Passage, or my new adventure, the Story Circle. So all of my work is a culmination of a lifetime of exploring and experiences and testing other people's ideas and seeing what works for me and taking a bit of this and a bit of that. But what I've managed to boil it down to is three main foundations, and those three foundations are: 1, your stories are valid. 2, your stories can be changed. And 3, the quality of your stories depends on the quality of questions that you're asking. So number 1, your stories are valid. I know a lot of people, including myself at various points, struggle with validating their own stories, with acknowledging that even their small stories are worth exploring, are worth sharing. I know for me there was years where I didn't think that I was big enough yet, or I didn't think I was experienced enough yet to share where I was up to. I thought I had to have some big dramatic story that I was already through for my story to be valid and worth sharing and valuable to other people. So until we get to acknowledging that our stories are valid, we can't change them. We're stuck wherever we're up to. Until we start a practice of acknowledging our stories, acknowledging our feelings, acknowledging where we're up to, we can't develop a practice of following our own wisdom, of honoring our own experience. And until we do those things, we're constantly relying on external sources, and we're stuck in this kind of insecurity, instability, this quicksand of other people's opinions and their input. So learning how to acknowledge your own stories and letting them be valid is a really important part of the work that we do in our storytelling. I also really like the idea of our old stories, our stories that don't serve us, being dirty pots. And there's this idea that you can't, well, it's not an idea, it's a fact. You can't clean a dirty pot without getting the water dirty. So some people want to kind of skip through to the lovely, pretty, clean, finished version. But if you've got a dirty story going on, if you've got a story going on that is painful and doesn't serve you, you need to clean the pot. You need to see that that pot is dirty in the first place. So that's also a part of the importance of validating our stories. We can say, I'm hurt in this area, I'm unclear in this area, and we can get to scrubbing that pot so that it becomes nice and clean and we can make tasty, tasty new dishes instead of just teaching ourselves to be okay with that slightly burnt taste in our stories for the rest of our lives. So that's pillar number 1. Our stories, your stories, no matter how big, how small, how dirty, how unpolished, all of our stories are valid and our own wisdom is valid, and we are the only experts on our own story. So after we get to acknowledging that our stories are valid, the next step is to understand and experience the fact that we can change our own stories. We can take these dirty pots and we can clean them. I like to think of the idea that there's this master magician kind of videographer in my mind, and at every moment this videographer is recording everything that's going on around me. And so what happens is at the end of every day or at the end of every encounter, my little editor, so my values and beliefs, my editor goes through and cuts out the pieces of those recordings that fit with my current life story and presents me with this highlights reel. And this highlights reel is what I play back in the future. So I've recorded multiple reels of film of my childhood, for example, and based on my beliefs at the time, I cut and edited different pieces together to form a coherent story based on what I was believing at the time. And for me, a really profound area that I've used this approach of rewriting my stories is in the area of men. And I had this story and this proof that the men in my childhood abandoned me. And I had taken all of this footage in that I'd recorded as a child, and I'd edited it based on that belief and that understanding, and I'd come up with this reel of film that showed me that men were unreliable and had abandoned me. And it wasn't until a few years ago that I went back and I looked at all of that archived footage, if you will, and I collected other pieces of footage, other examples of a new belief that I've always been supported by the men in my life, and I've always been looked after and adored and cherished and all of those kind of things. And I found example after example. There was my circus teacher when I was 10. There was like my librarian when I was in primary school, my grade 4 teacher who inspired my love of poetry, all of these men who had contributed in these various ways. But for years I just blocked out those pieces of footage. I'd left them on the cutting room floor. And so, like I said, a few years ago I went back and I assembled a new story based on a new belief that I was willing to hold and that I wanted to be true for me. So in this way, we can actually go back and change the past. Our stories of the past aren't static. There's no story that has to be true for us forever. We can take our new understandings and our new beliefs and go back through the archives of our own footage and create a new story reel and have that as our dominant story. And so for me, these days, that is my dominant story. When you ask me about the men in my childhood, that's what I go to. I think of all of these multiple examples of ways that I was supported and shown that I was loved and inspired and given creative foundations and all of those kind of things. So that's one way that I've personally used that idea. So that's the second principle. The second principle is that all of our stories can be changed. Obviously, that's looking more towards the past. And the third principle ties in with the past and the future, and that is that the quality of our stories depends on the quality of the questions that we're asking. So in my example, with men in my life, I had gone from a really non-serving question of why do the men in my life always abandon me? And so with that kind of question, you come up with answers to that question, obviously. So you find proof of the truth of that question. And so then I went to a new question, which was something along the lines of, how can I forgive the men in my childhood who abandoned me? Or how can I understand and be at peace with the experiences that I've had with men in my past? And so that was better. That was a next step. But it wasn't until I really upped that question, I made it a really juicy, loving, vibrant, inspiring question along the lines of, where were the examples of the men who supported me and loved me and cherished me? When I asked that kind of question, then my mind, this amazing filter that it is, went back and found example after example after example after example. And I wouldn't have found those examples. I literally wouldn't have found those examples had I not been asking that new question. So that's a way that we can use these new questions to tell new stories of our past, but also when we're looking at the future or when we're looking at our right now situation or circumstance, the questions that we're asking ourselves define the experiences that we're having right now. So I could be going somewhere and I get stuck in traffic, and so A non-serving question would be something along the lines of, why does this always happen to me? I always get stuck. Why is life conspiring against me, or something crazy like that? Or the next level question would be, I wonder what potential disaster I avoided by being late, or something like that. Or a next question could be, what's great about this? I wonder what new idea will come into my head because I get to spend these extra 5 minutes in the car. Or if I get fired from a job, for example, instead of having a question along the lines of, why doesn't anything work out for me, and why is life against me, and blah blah blah, any of those kind of questions, that can be something more along the lines of, I wonder what amazing project I'll be available for now. Or we can use more creative questions to ask ourselves about things that we might have default answers to. So instead of saying, how are you, to someone, which is something we say all the time, we could say, what is the thing that brings you the most joy right now? We can ask ourselves that. And in this process of asking new, more interesting, more creative questions, we begin a practice of staying open to new answers. So we let go of this idea of static responses, and we create more space in our lives and in our stories for evolving our beliefs and our experience, and stepping more into interesting, curious, creative, love-filled, joyful, delightful places. So asking new questions is a really, really important part of changing our stories. So that's the third pillar of 3. We've got number 1, our stories are valid. So we need to acknowledge where we're up to do anything, to be able to move forward. And number 2, our stories can be changed. So I find that in the act of writing out a story, or even in the act of speaking a story, we are given a moment of space, or the understanding of space, that our stories are not who we are. Our stories are things that we're creating, and because they're things we're creating, we can recreate them and we can change them. I'm sure we've all had that experience of having a conversation and talking about where we're up to, only to realize as we listen to ourselves that we don't believe that anymore, or that we've changed since the last time we told this story. So that's a really important part of the processes that I go on and lead people on. And the third pillar of the 3 is the understanding that the quality of the questions we ask determines the quality of the answers that we go looking for. Our mind is a brilliant filter, and will find, if we give it enough time, space and support, answers to any questions that we ask it. So the more creative, the more open and expansive our questions, the more creative and open and expansive our answers will be. So that's a brief little summary of the foundations of the work that I do, whether that be sharing my own writing or creative process in performance poetry or whatever. And in my story circles, in rites of passage, in all of the things I do, those are the common 3 foundations. Your stories are valid, your stories can be changed, and the quality of your stories depends on the quality of the questions that you're asking. So I'd love to have you come along and experience that process for yourself. So check in with me about when my next projects are. Lots of love. See ya.